I had been gone for 13 months, long enough for the dust of Iraq to settle into every crease of my uniform and long enough for the desert sun to carve sharp lines into my face. When the wheels of the plane finally touched down at Boston Logan, I expected relief. Instead, I felt a strange quiet settle over me, the kind that comes right before a storm. I drove north for hours with the window cracked open, letting the cold Maine air fight the heat that still lived under my skin. By the time the lighthouse at Bar Harbor came into view, I could almost pretend I was ready to come home. I told myself the worst was behind me. Baghdad was far away. Camp Victory was far behind. I had survived the loss of Sergeant Molina. I had survived dead ends in intel rooms and long nights decoding signals while mortars thumped somewhere in the distance. If I could survive that, I could survive a front porch in Maine. At least that is what I thought. The gravel under my boots made the familiar crunch as I climbed the steps to my mother's house. It looked smaller than I remembered, the blue paint more faded, the wooden railing warped from salt air and years of neglect. My father had built this porch board by board. I paused at the door and let my hand rest on the spot he once sanded smooth while I held nails for him. For a split second, I was 19 again, listening to him laugh. Then the door lock clicked and the memory shattered. The door opened just a few inches. My mother peeked out with the kind of smile people wear when they are bracing for impact. "Nora," she whispered, like my name was something fragile. Before I could answer, the door was yanked wider. Jake Harlow stepped into the frame, all broad shoulders and stale beer breath. He smelled like a man who blamed everyone except himself for the shape of his life. His eyes dragged over my uniform with irritation rather than pride. "So the soldier returns," he said. "Welcome back." I barely had time to exhale before his fist connected with my cheek. A hot streak of pain shot through my jaw and the porch spun sideways. My shoulder hit the railing with a crack, and for a heartbeat I saw Iraq again. Not the heat, not the sand, just the violence that always came faster than thought. Except here, there were no alarms, no radios, no chain of command. Just my mother's gasp cutting through the air like a knife. Jake stepped over me as if I were nothing more than clutter on the floor. "You do not live here anymore," he barked. His voice echoed through the quiet street. The world narrowed to a small ring of spinning light. I tasted iron. My training screamed at me to take control of the threat, but something deeper told me to stay still. Behind Jake, I spotted movement across the street. Mrs. Avery, the neighbor who always watered her garden at sunrise, stood frozen with a hose dangling from her hand. Her husband stood beside her, their eyes wide. Witnesses. Good. I let the calm settle into me the way it had on long nights in Baghdad. I pushed myself upright slowly, never breaking eye contact with Jake. My mother reached for me but stopped halfway, fingers trembling in midair as if an invisible leash pulled her back. I saw everything in her face. Fear, submission, years of silence. Jake hovered above me waiting for me to break or shout or retaliate, but I just wiped the blood from my lip with the back of my hand. "That is what you think I said quietly. The kind of quiet that makes men like him lean back without knowing why." His expression flickered. Confusion first, then anger, then something close to uncertainty. For the first time, he realized he did not scare me. Not anymore. I stood fully and stepped off the porch. I had not raised a hand. He had struck first. The neighbors had seen. The bruise was already forming. This was no longer a family problem. This was evidence. My mother whispered my name again, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and deliberate. I took one last look at the house. At the chipped paint, at the windows my father once polished every Sunday morning. I whispered inside my head, "I am home, Dad." But not for peace, for truth, for justice, for the things you taught me to never let slide. I turned down the path toward my car. Behind me, Jake shouted something I no longer cared to hear. I did not look back. The real battle had just begun. And this time, I was not fighting in the desert. I was fighting on my own front porch. If you came home from war only to find a different kind of battle waiting for you right at the door, what would you do? I used to think that 13 months was enough time for a person to grow numb to anything. Heat, dust, noise, even fear. Iraq had a way of pressing all of those things into your mind until they felt like part of your bloodstream. When I close my eyes, I can still feel the vibration of the armored convoy under my boots and the heavy thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the sky over Camp Victory. Baghdad in 2024 was not the same place the news showed. It was not just conflict zones and armored walls. It was the echo of calls to prayer drifting across the compound at dawn, stray cats weaving through concrete barriers, and children waving at our trucks from rooftops. It was small moments of humanity swallowed by long stretches of tension. As an Army intelligence officer, my days rarely involved the direct chaos the infantry faced. My battlefield was a dimly lit room with screens, maps, and radio chatter that never quite stopped. I analyzed signals sifted through human entries, tracked the movement of small groups who operated where the lines between friend and foe blurred. On good days, our work prevented something from happening. On bad days, it told us why something already had. The memory that haunts me most begins with a whisper through my headset, a soft crackle followed by Melina's voice. Sergeant Adrian Molina. People used to call him the pulse of our unit. A calm voice in the middle of any storm. He was the kind of soldier who never forgot a birthday, who always carried extra water bottles for new recruits, and who somehow found a way to make the bare concrete of a holding area feel like a place worth sitting in. He was my closest friend in those 13 months, which is why I still hear him. Nora. We are adjusting course. Stay on channel. Nothing about his tone told me it was the last time I would hear him speak in real time. His patrol was supporting a lead we had worked on for weeks, a location tied to a group that kept slipping from our grasp like smoke. By the time I caught the faint shift in one of the intercepted transmissions, I knew something was off. The signal traffic spiked, a warning sign, too sharp, too sudden. I flagged it instantly. Shift left route, now! I could feel urgency climbing up my spine. Melina responded, Copy. Adjusting left, but they never made it to the adjusted path. None of us knew that an old roadside hazard hidden under loose debris waited on the original route. The blast shook my room even though it happened miles away. A brief rumble and then a deafening silence in the comms. When the line finally buzzed again, it was not Melina. It was the strained voice of another soldier trying to stay steady while describing what was left. I had heard loss before, but this hit in a way nothing else had. I had been trained to detach, to filter, to compartmentalize, but some moments carve straight through training like it is paper. For days after the incident, I replayed every step of the intel timeline, every intercepted message, every delayed report, every line I could have drawn differently. Survivor guilt does not arrive like a wave. It arrives like a blade, one cut at a time, slicing through the places where you keep your discipline and turning everything soft. There were nights I sat outside the barracks counting breaths the way our mental health officer taught us. There were mornings where I looked at my uniform in the mirror and wondered whether I deserved to wear something that Adrian Molina once stood beside. But the work did not stop for grief. The heat did not pause to give you time to recover. There were still signals to review, assessments to prepare, and patterns to recognize. Pain had to wait. In a place like that, it always waited. I told myself that finishing the mission was the only way to honor him. When the rotation finally came to an end, I thought going home would turn the noise in my head down. Maine was supposed to be a place where the air was crisp and clean, where water brushed the shoreline instead of sand, where grief had room to breathe. I convinced myself that I would step into my mother's house and feel something close to peace. I imagined walking into my old room and seeing the corner of the desk where I once studied late into the night. I imagined sitting with my mother at the kitchen table and telling her stories about the good parts of deployment, the moments she would be proud of, the moments I could speak about without breaking. I convinced myself that Maine would fix something in me, that being home would remind me who I was before Baghdad and before explosions snatched good men away from us. But standing on that porch with my cheek burning from my stepfather's strike, with the taste of iron in my mouth and my mother frozen behind him, I realized something I had never allowed myself to admit. War does not end just because you board a plane. And sometimes the battlefield waiting for you at home is colder than any desert night. I survived Iraq, but healing does not come from distance. Healing requires truth. And the truth hit harder than any blast we ever studied. The fight I thought I had left behind had followed me home, and this time it had a face I knew. Bar Harbor was the kind of place people saved for on their calendars. They circled summer dates in bright ink and told their coworkers they could not wait to breathe real ocean air again. When I was a kid, I used to think the entire world came alive only on our coastline. Cruise ships drifted into Frenchman Bay like floating hotels while tourists strolled the shore path with ice cream cones dripping onto their fingers. Everything sparkled under the sun. Everything smelled like salt pine and freedom. But that version of Bar Harbor belonged to my childhood. When I drove into town after 13 months in Iraq, the streets looked familiar but hollow. The gift shops were still open. The fishermen were still unloading their lobster crates at the pier. The ocean still glittered as if nothing in the world ever went wrong. Yet standing among all of that beauty felt like returning to a book you used to love only to realize the pages smelled different. The air felt sharper. The spaces between houses felt too quiet. Even the sound of gulls felt distant, as if something had muted the town in the years I had been away. My parents' house sat 3 blocks from the shore path, tucked behind a line of tall spruce trees that creaked when the wind shifted. I once loved that creaking. It used to sound like the trees were whispering secrets to each other. Now the same sound felt like a warning. My father built that house the year I turned 8. He spent months sanding the floors and carving the banisters. Every corner held something he had touched. After he passed away suddenly when I was 19, everything changed. Grief did not just crack the foundation of our family, it split the walls open. I was stationed at Fort Hood at the time, training with my unit. I begged command for 2 extra days after the funeral to help my mother, but the request came back denied. It was the first time I felt powerless in uniform. When I returned to base, I carried my guilt like a second backpack. Back then, my mother was fragile, but not broken. She cried often, but she still baked blueberry muffins on Sundays and still walked the shore path at sunset like she used to with my father. Then, in 2015, she met Jake Harlow, a man who seemed at first glance like he could fix what life had stolen from her. He was polite in that rehearsed way men sometimes are when they want something. He brought flowers to the house twice a week. He used words like darling and sweetheart and talked about how lucky he felt to have found her. And for a while, I believed he might actually care for her. The first red flag did not appear until the day I came home on short notice from Fort Hood and found my mother's photo albums stuffed into a box in the attic. They were the albums she used to flip through every winter, smiling at pictures of my dad sanding the porch railing or teaching me how to tie fishing knots. When I asked her why they were upstairs, she told me Jake thought they took up too much space. Too many memories, he had said. Too heavy. Soon after that, he convinced her to switch her bank account into a joint one. Said it would help with bills. Said she needed someone to take care of the hard stuff. I was in the middle of a field exercise when she called to tell me the change. I did not argue. Soldiers learn early to pick their battles. But even then, I felt something twist in my chest. Months later, the friends she used to meet for coffee stopped coming by. She told me they were busy, but her voice sounded rehearsed. By 2018, she no longer attended the church she loved. By 2019, she stopped walking the shore path entirely. And by 2020, the only time she left the house was for work or errands that Jake approved. People in Bar Harbor are polite to a fault. They see things, they hear things, but unless someone screams for help, they treat every issue as a private matter. A few neighbors later admitted they occasionally heard raised voices. A door slammed, a dish breaking, a cry muffled too quickly, but nobody stepped in. Nobody asked if she was safe. That is the dangerous thing about pretty towns. They hide their fractures under layers of scenery. When I drove past the harbor on my way back from Boston, the smell of the ocean filled the car the same way it always had. But this time, it carried something heavier. I could not stop thinking about the nights I used to sleep with my bedroom door cracked open just enough for the hallway light to reach my pillow. In that crack of light, I always felt safe. Now, even the memory of that glow felt wrong. I parked the car in the driveway and stared at the house for a full minute before stepping out. I felt like a stranger trespassing on my own childhood. I ran my fingers along the wooden railing my father built and whispered under my breath, "I survived Iraq, but I am not sure I can survive this house." The truth was simple and painful. War zones teach you to recognize danger quickly, to trust the alarms in your gut. And as I stood beneath the spruce trees listening to them creak in the cold wind, the alarm inside me rang loud. It told me this town had changed. It told me my mother had changed. It told me Jake had become something I should have confronted years ago. But most of all, it told me that returning home would not heal anything. Not unless I was willing to tear into the roots of the rot that had spread through every corner of my father's house. Bar Harbor might have been beautiful for the world, but for me, it had become a battlefield disguised as a postcard. And the closer I walked toward that front door, the more I understood that the danger waiting inside did not care whether I wore a uniform or not. It cared only that I had finally come back. My mother asked me to stay the night the way someone asks a firefighter to stay close after smelling smoke. Her voice was soft but shaky, a thin thread stretched too tight. I agreed, even though every instinct told me the smart move was to create distance, gather myself, and return with a plan. But she looked at me with eyes that had forgotten how to hope, and I could not leave her alone in that house. Not after what happened on the porch. Not knowing what Jake was capable of when the sun went down. She cooked dinner as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the first sign. People who live in fear learn to behave like everything is normal. They stir sauce with trembling hands. They set the table with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. They laugh too quickly and smile too widely because silence is dangerous in a house like that. I sat at the old kitchen table I grew up around, the one my father refinished 3 times because he said wood deserved a second chance. Jake dropped into his seat across from me with the heavy thud of a man claiming territory. His chair scraped the floor even though he had plenty of room to pull it back quietly. He cracked open a beer before my mother even placed the food on the table. He chewed loudly, exaggerating each bite like he wanted his presence to fill every inch of the room. His lip curled when he looked at my uniform. "So I guess the Army sends people home early when they fail something. Is that how it works?" His voice was slow and low, the kind meant to bait someone into reacting. "Real soldiers do not come back early unless they messed up." I did not flinch. Army intelligence training had drilled restraint into me until it became muscle memory. In our line of work, reacting too fast could ruin an operation. Silence was strategic. Observation was survival. So I simply lifted my fork and kept eating. My mother laughed in a high-pitched tone that was not laughter at all. It was fear wearing a mask. She tried to steer the conversation toward neutral ground, but Jake cut her off every time, interrupting her mid-sentence with a grunt or a smirk or a comment about how she talked too much. She shrank a little more each time. I watched her eyes flick toward the clock on the wall, then toward me, then toward Jake. Patterns. Typical signs of someone accustomed to measuring danger in minutes and glances. He finished his first beer quickly and popped open another. He drank it in slow swallows, staring at me like he was deciding whether I was worth provoking again. I kept my breathing steady. I had been in interrogation rooms where grown men tried to read my face for weakness. Those rooms always smelled like sweat and metal. This one smelled like lemon dish soap and fear. My mother finally tried to break the tension. "Nora can stay as long as she wants." She said it so quietly I almost missed it. Jake barked a laugh. "As long as she wants. Under my roof." His words weren't loud, but they sliced through the air sharply enough to make my mother jump. I recognized the technique. Control through tone rather than volume. A man who knew exactly how little force he needed to exert to keep someone in line. I set my fork down gently and looked straight at him, not with challenge, not with fear, just neutrality. It rattled him. Neutrality often does. My father used to say that bullies expect either submission or confrontation. What they do not know how to handle is calm. Calm exposes them. Jake leaned back in his chair and kicked his feet up on the table leg. The gesture was meant to say he owned the space, the air, the people inside the room. But for a second, just 1 second, I saw something flicker in his expression. Uncertainty. My lack of reaction was not the response he expected. My mother stood abruptly and reached for the dishes. I stood too, offering to help, and for a moment she looked relieved, but when Jake slammed his beer bottle onto the table, she froze, then stepped back like she had touched something hot. "Sit down, Evelyn," he said. She obeyed instantly, her shoulders folded inward. That was when something cold and steady slid into place inside me. Fear was not the only thing living in this house. Control was here too, the kind that grew in the dark in whispered apologies and long nights, where someone convinced you that survival depended on obedience, the kind that burrowed deep until you believed it. We finished the rest of dinner in a silence so heavy it felt like a third person in the room. After the last dish was cleared, Jake reached into his pocket and tossed something onto the table. It landed with a dull clatter. A small metal tin. My mother's tip money from the diner, crumpled bills and coins. "You want a roof?" he said slowly. "You follow my rules." The insult was not in the words, but in the performance of power. In the way he made sure the money hit the table hard enough to echo. In the way my mother's hands trembled as she reached for it. I stared at him the way I used to study enemy patterns on a screen. Not with emotion, with precision, his temper, his timing, his need to dominate, his confidence that nobody would hold him accountable. Abusers always leave a trail, and now I knew where to start tracking. I stayed silent, but something inside me shifted. I was not here to win dinner table arguments. I was here to collect evidence, witness behavior, document tone, observe financial control, map the terrain of his manipulation the same way I mapped enemy territory overseas. The battle in this house was not won with fists or raised voices. It was won with truth, and the time for truth had finally begun. My father's house never used to feel like a place that could break. When I was little, I believed its wooden beams were stronger than storms, stronger than time, stronger than anything life could throw at us. That confidence came from the man who built it. Thomas Whitfield did not just put walls around us. He gave those walls a spine. He carved our initials into the baseboard of the front door because he believed homes should hold the people who lived in them. He taught me how to measure twice and cut once how to sand a board until it felt like silk under my fingertips, how to tell the difference between cedar that would last 30 years and cedar that would crumble after 3 winters. He fixed everything slowly and with intention. He used to say that rushing a job was like lying. You might fool someone for a minute, but the truth always showed up eventually. He believed in honesty so deeply that he treated it like a tool he carried in his belt. That house reflected him. Every window frame he built was level by instinct. Every corner he finished held a quiet dignity. The porch railing he carved with his own hands was the last project we worked on together. I held the screws in a small tin cup while he drilled each board into place. That railing was still there the morning Jake hit me, though the wood had faded and a crack near the bottom hinted at years of neglect. After my father passed away unexpectedly when I was 19, the foundation of our family shifted instantly. My mother went from a woman who baked bread on Saturdays and hummed old Fleetwood Mac songs while cleaning to someone who forgot to eat unless I reminded her. Grief drowned her slowly. I left for Fort Hood 6 months later, carrying guilt heavy enough to bow my shoulders. I told myself the Army would make me stronger, and in some ways it did. But in leaving, I opened the door for someone else to step in. When I came home for the first holiday after completing training, I noticed things were different. The house smelled like furniture polish instead of my mother's cooking. My father's tools were no longer hung neatly in the shed, but tossed into crates. The carved wooden photo frame he gave her on their 10th anniversary was gone from the living room shelf. She said she had put it away for safekeeping, but there was something in her eyes that made me doubt it. What I did not know then was that she had already met Jake, a man who made himself useful before he made himself necessary. He offered to handle things around the property. He offered to help her with paperwork. He offered to shoulder her burdens. She accepted because grief makes people reach for any hand that promises stability, even if the hand belongs to someone who sees opportunity instead of pain. Years passed like that, quietly, unevenly. During my early deployments and training cycles, I was too far away to see the signs clearly. A joint bank account here. A bill I thought she should not have been paying there. her voice becoming softer on the phone, her pauses becoming longer. By the time I was 27, she rarely spoke about the house at all. It was as though my father's craftsmanship had become a room she could not bear to enter. The last time I visited before the Iraq deployment, I found the folder that held my father's property documents tucked behind a box in the attic. The papers were worn at the edges but still legible. His signature was steady as always. There it was. Proof that he had left the house to my mother with instructions ensuring I retained partial rights as his only child. I remember sitting on the attic floor with dust clinging to my uniform pants while I whispered promises to a man who could no longer hear them. I would protect what he built. I would honor what he left us. But when I asked my mother about the documents that afternoon, she panicked lightly and said Jake handled all the house paperwork now. Something inside me tightened. My father had taught me how to read people long before the Army ever trained me to. My mother's eyes darted in a way that told me she was hiding something not because she wanted to, but because she felt she had no choice. After she married Jake, he took over the finances entirely. He convinced her that she was too overwhelmed to manage the house on her own, that he could do it better, that she could trust him. And she did. Trust is a fragile thing when someone is drowning. Standing in that same house after my return from Iraq, I could feel the imbalance everywhere. The creaking floorboards sounded different, as if the weight of years had distorted the structure. The hallways felt narrower. Even the colors on the walls seemed muted compared to how I remembered them. The house had not changed. The meaning of it had. I looked around and saw small signs that someone had been slowly rewriting the story of this home. My father's hand-carved compass that used to sit on the mantel was missing. The framed blueprint of the porch railing he and I drew together was no longer hanging by the stairs. The photo of him holding me on his shoulders at Sand Beach had been replaced with a generic art print. Those objects were not simply moved. They were erased. My breath tightened as I pieced it together. Jake did not just want control of my mother. He wanted control of the house, of the legacy, of the last thing my father ever built with love. And he had almost succeeded. Almost. But I had seen those original papers. I had touched them. I knew what my father intended, and if those documents had been altered or hidden since then, there was only one explanation. Someone had tampered with them. Someone who was counting on my absence. Someone who believed nobody would question him. I stood alone in the living room where sunlight filtered through the blinds and fell across the floor like stripes. For a moment, I felt the weight of every deployment pressing down on me. Then something else rose to the surface. Resolve. If Jake had tampered with my father's legacy, then this was not just a family problem. This was a violation, a calculated act, a deception that needed to be uncovered piece by piece. And I was the exact wrong soldier to underestimate. Morning light in Bar Harbor has a way of revealing things you tried to ignore the night before. It cuts through curtains with sharp clarity, the kind you cannot hide from. I woke with a dull ache along my cheekbone, a reminder of the fist that had greeted me before I even stepped fully into the house. My skin felt tight and swollen, and when I touched the bruise with the tips of my fingers, a low throb pulsed beneath the surface. It was a pain I could manage. Pain had never frightened me. What mattered was what the bruise represented. Evidence. Army protocol teaches us early. Document everything. Injuries, conditions, timelines, names. A bruise is not just a mark, it is data. So before I even brushed my teeth, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, held my phone steady, and captured every angle of the damage. Straight on. Left tilt, right tilt, natural light, shadowed light. A slow turn of my chin. Multiple shots. I labeled them with the time and date. My reflection looked back at me with the detached calm that only comes from years of training. I almost looked like a stranger who happened to wear my uniform and carry my memories. After I finished documenting the bruise, I stepped outside to breathe air that did not taste like tension. The morning was bright but cold enough to sting my lungs. I walked toward Main Street because movement helped me think. I was halfway to the harbor when I heard someone call my name. Nora Whitfield. I turned and saw a tall man in a sheriff deputy uniform walking toward me with a half smile and a squint that came from too many years driving patrol routes at sunrise. Luke Morrison. We went to high school together before my world shifted toward bases deployments and long nights under foreign skies. He had aged well, the same steady posture, the same careful eyes. Back in school, he had a quiet crush on me that I pretended not to notice. Now, he carried himself like a man who knew exactly how to read a situation before stepping into it. "You are back," he said gently, not as a question, but as acknowledgement. I nodded. For now. He looked at my cheek. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not ask if I was okay. Men like Luke know that question is pointless when the answer is too complicated to offer in a sidewalk conversation. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and lowered his voice. Jake did that. I met his gaze and held it. "Yes." He exhaled a slow release of frustration. "Jake is on our radar already. Too many complaints from neighbors. Noise reports, disturbances." He lowered his voice even further. "One hospital visit last year that never added up." My stomach tightened. I had suspected as much, but hearing it said aloud shifted something. Patterns, habits, history. Luke studied my reaction. "You staying at the house?" For one night, I said, "No longer." He nodded as though that was the answer he hoped to hear. He was never a man who wasted words. "If you need anything," he said, "you call me. Do not let him corner you. Not in that house, not anywhere." I appreciated the warning, but I also understood the limits of what he could do. Without evidence, without documentation, without action on my part, his hands were tied. That was the painful truth about law enforcement in small towns. Everyone sees. No one intervenes until someone forces their hand. I thanked him and continued walking until the harbor came into full view. Boats rocked gently in the water, the kind of peaceful scene people frame in postcards. But peace was not what I felt. I sat on a bench overlooking the water and sifted through everything Luke had said. "Jake's on our radar already." That one sentence confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since I stepped back into my childhood home. This was not just about tension or household stress or a man with a temper. This was a pattern, a cycle, a slow tightening of control. And if my mother had been living inside that storm for years, then untangling it would require discipline, caution, and precision. War zone precision. I opened the Notes app on my phone and began to draft my plan the same way I drafted mission outlines overseas. Step 1. Collect evidence of violence. Photographs. Dates. Witness names. Step 2. Review property documents. Compare the original deed I saw years ago with whatever Jake had her sign. Look for forgery indicators. Step 3. Identify financial inconsistencies. Bank accounts, withdrawals, loan applications. Step 4. Trigger public behavior. Abusers often hide behind private doors but unravel in public. If Jake lost control around witnesses, it would strengthen everything. Step 5. Leverage legal channels. Luke, Sheriff's Office. JAG if necessary. I stared at the list for a long moment. It looked less like a plan for a daughter and more like a plan for an intelligence officer. But maybe that was who I needed to be right now. Someone who could separate emotion from strategy. Someone who could build a case the way others built walls. Someone who could take years of silent suffering and turn it into truth etched in ink and sworn statements. When I returned to the house, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea untouched in front of her. She looked up at me with a blend of guilt and relief, as if she still hoped this was all a misunderstanding, but knew in her bones it was not. I sat across from her and placed my phone on the table face down. "Mom," I said quietly, "I need to ask you some questions." She swallowed hard. "About Jake." Her hands trembled slightly around the handle of her cup, the kind of tremble that comes from years of walking on eggshells. I kept my voice soft but steady. "I am not here to start fights. I am here to understand the truth." She pressed her lips together and nodded once, a small motion but huge in meaning. That was when I knew this was not just a mission. It was a rescue, and I was not walking away until it was finished. There is a certain stillness inside a house where people are afraid to open drawers. Fear changes the sound of everything. The way papers slide. The way floorboards creak. The way a door shuts a little too quietly. That stillness hung in the air the moment I stepped into the hallway and glanced toward the small room my mother once called her office. Before Jake moved in, she used to do everything there: bills, grocery lists, birthday cards. After he married her, the room turned into a storage space. At least that was what she told me. But as I walked past the half-closed door, I saw something else. A sliver of truth wedged into the shadows. Piles of envelopes. Shoeboxes stacked in uneven towers. A metal file cabinet pushed against the wall with dust on the handle as if nobody had dared touch it in years. I waited until my mother stepped into the laundry room where the sound of the dryer tumbling offered a small blanket of noise. Then I pushed the office door open and slipped inside. The air smelled stale, paper and old carpet. A thin layer of dust coated everything but the top of the desk, where a clean square marked where something had recently been moved. Probably something Jake did not want my mother to see. I scanned the room the way I would scan a safe house. Slow, methodical. I reached for the first drawer. Locked. Which made no sense. My mother never locked anything before. The second drawer slid open easily, revealing envelopes, tax notices, receipts, a few old utility bills. At first glance, everything looked normal, but the postmarks told a different story. Some of the tax letters were addressed only to Jake. Others were addressed to both of them, even though the house had always been in my mother's name. And then I saw it, an envelope from a bank I did not recognize. I opened it carefully. Inside was a debit card with my mother's name embossed next to Jake's. A tidy little piece of shared access. My stomach tightened. My mother never mentioned having a joint account with him. I checked the rest of the drawer. Hidden beneath the envelopes was a small notebook. My mother's handwriting filled the pages in neat slanted lines, but the entries were short. Grocery totals, tip money, notes about what Jake bought, what Jake needed. Reminders to ask Jake before using the card. A woman who once handled every expense in the house had turned into someone afraid to buy a gallon of milk without approval. That was the clearest sign of control, not bruises, not broken objects, quiet financial suffocation. The door creaked slightly behind me and I turned. My mother stood in the doorway. Her hands were clasped together like she was holding something fragile between her fingers. "What are you doing in here, Nora?" Her voice was soft but strained. I lifted the bank envelope just enough for her to see it. "Mom, when did this start?" She looked away almost immediately. "He handles the finances. I am not good with numbers." That sentence struck me harder than any punch. My mother had balanced every bill in this house for 20 years. She paid taxes, managed home repairs, ran the household budget with precision. She taught me how to read a bank statement when I was 12. And now she claimed she was not good with numbers. That was not insecurity. That was conditioning. I took a step closer. "Mom, did you sign anything you did not understand?" She blinked slowly. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she reached for a stack of envelopes as if the simple act of holding something would shield her from the truth of her answer. Her silence was the confirmation. People rarely lie to protect themselves. They lie to protect the person who controls them. Her shoulders curled inward. Her breath shook. I softened my voice. "I am not accusing you of doing anything wrong. I am just trying to understand." More silence. More pain filling the spaces between us. Finally, she whispered, "He said it was easier if he took care of everything. Bills, papers, all of it." I swallowed the anger rising in my chest. Anger never solved anything. Precision did. I sat at the desk and spread out everything on the surface. Tax letters, bank envelopes, that joint debit card. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the scanner app I used overseas to record field documents. One by one, I scanned every sheet, front and back. I kept the camera steady. I recorded dates. I saved them to a secure folder. My mother watched me with a mixture of confusion and a quiet flicker of something deeper. Relief, maybe. Or fear. Maybe both. When I finished scanning, I opened my encrypted email and attached the files to Captain Rivers, my JAG contact from earlier deployments. He had always been fair, efficient, a man who did not waste time with nonsense. Subject line: possible fraudulent signatures and financial control. I hit send. My mother stepped back as if she had just seen me open a door she did not know existed. "What are you going to do, Nora?" I looked up at her. "The truth, Mom. That is all." I could see the war inside her. Loyalty versus fear. Survival versus shame. But she did not stop me. She simply nodded once as tears gathered behind her eyes. That was the moment I realized something important. She did not need me to save her. She needed me to remind her she deserved saving. I closed the folder and stood. The house felt different now. Not safer, but clearer. Sometimes the first countermove is not the dramatic one. It is the quiet shift. The moment you decide to stop being afraid of what the truth will expose. And that moment had just arrived. Jake must have sensed the shift in the air the same way animals sense a coming storm. Control is fragile, and men like him survive by sniffing out anything that threatens their grip. By the next afternoon, he was pacing the living room with short, irritated steps, opening and closing drawers he had no reason to touch, glancing at me the way someone glances at a locked door they are not sure who holds the key to. He knew something had changed. He just did not know what. Yet. I kept my movements calm, measured. I sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee as if I were simply visiting home for a peaceful weekend. But inside, I tracked every sound, every shift in tone, every sign that his facade was beginning to crack. It happened when he walked into the kitchen and saw my phone on the table beside me. His eyes landed on it with a flash of suspicion so quick most people would have missed it. But not me. He leaned against the counter. "You writing something down about me, Nora? You always watching. That is your thing, right? Army stuff." I did not look up from my coffee. "Just breathing Jake." He snorted and stepped closer. Too close. Men like him like to control space before they control anything else. When I did not react, he slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to rattle the cup. The sound exploded in the quiet house. My mother jumped from across the room like someone had set off a firecracker beside her ear. Jake watched my reaction, waiting, testing. I met his eyes without flinching. That bothered him more than if I had yelled. He straightened and grabbed a beer from the counter. The crack of the opening tab broke the silence like another warning. He took a long swallow, then stepped toward me again. "You are snooping around. I can tell. You think I do not see it. What are you trying to find?" I tilted my head slightly. A small gesture. Controlled. Neutral. It irritated him. He tossed the empty beer bottle toward my feet. It hit the floor so close I felt the air shift near my ankle, but it did not touch me. That was intentional. That was strategy. He wanted the threat without the consequence. He wanted to show dominance without crossing the line the law could use against him. Men who rely on intimidation instead of intelligence always forget one thing. Proximity without impact is still evidence. My mother stood frozen near the stove, clutching a dish towel in her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "Jake, please." "Stop." He did not even look at her. His eyes stayed locked on me. "You think you can come back here wearing that uniform and push me around? You think you can stir things up?" I still did not move. He stepped closer. One more inch and he would be well within my arm's reach. He knew it. I knew it. And he knew exactly why I was not stopping him. That was when I saw the cracks forming, in his posture, in his breathing, in the way his jaw twitched like he was grinding down a word he didn't want to say out loud. He was afraid. Not of me, but of what I carried. Knowledge, evidence, documentation. The only thing men like him fear is when the narrative slips out of their control. I slowly reached for the fork on the table and set it aside. A small, mundane action, but the movement caused my smartwatch to glare under the overhead light. Army issued. Steel face. Secure recording function. His eyes flicked toward it. Suspicion sharpened into panic fast and hot. "You recording me?" He took a step back. Not much, but enough. That was the moment I realized exactly how to break him down properly, calmly. Legally. Strategically. I lifted my wrist and tapped the screen once, letting him wonder whether I had captured everything. Whether I had been collecting evidence since the minute I walked through the door, whether his own temper had already sealed his fate. Men like Jake are afraid of bruises when they are the ones wearing them. He pointed at my wrist with a shaky laugh. You better not be doing anything stupid, Nora. I leaned back in my chair. He is already angry, I said calmly. I am just giving him the rope. My mother's eyes filled with tears instantly. She whispered, Please do not make him angry, Nora. Please. I turned to her gently. Mom, he is already angry. I am not causing anything. I am exposing it. That sentence drew a sharp inhale from Jake. Exposure, the one thing he could not stand. He took another step back. His breathing grew louder. A crackling tension filled the room like static before a lightning strike. I rose from my chair slowly. With control. With purpose. I walked past him toward the doorway and felt the shift behind me. A hesitation. A faltering. A man beginning to understand he no longer controlled the temperature of the room. He no longer controlled her. He no longer controlled me. By the time I reached the hallway, I lifted my wrist again and tapped the screen. Not to record, but to let him think I was. His panic deepened just enough for me to see the truth. This man did not fear confrontation. He feared accountability, and that was what I intended to deliver. I reached the hallway, turned back toward my mother, and said quietly, Everything is going to come to light. His cracks were showing. Soon the whole facade would collapse, and I would be standing there with every piece he had tried so hard to hide. Town hall meetings in Bar Harbor had always been mundane events. People argued about parking permits, lobster trap limits, dock repairs, noise complaints, and whose dog was digging up whose yard. They were small-town rituals where nothing explosive ever happened, until the night Jake Harlow walked in. And I walked in after him. The meeting was held in the old brick municipal building at the center of town. Rows of metal folding chairs stretched across the room, and the overhead lights buzzed with the faint hum of bulbs on their last year of life. Locals brought thermoses of coffee. A few had clipboards. Everyone had opinions. Jake was there to petition for a small engine repair shop permit. He had been bragging for weeks that the town owed him the license that he was about to expand, that real men build their own businesses. He sat in the fourth row, shoulders back, jaw set, acting like a man about to receive a medal. My mother had been too afraid to attend, but I knew this was my moment. When I entered the room, several people nodded politely, recognizing me from years ago or from newspaper mentions when I deployed. I took a seat in the back. I wanted a clear line of sight. I wanted him to think I was quiet enough to ignore. The council moved through mundane agenda items. Parking complaints, trail maintenance, seasonal permits. Then came Jake's turn. He stood up with the swagger of a man convinced the entire town admired him. Thank you for hearing my application, he said with a slow voice that tried to sound humble but failed. I plan to open a repair shop on my property. Good for the local economy, good for business. A few people nodded. Some did not care at all, but then the council secretary asked a routine question. Have there been any safety concerns or neighborhood complaints related to your residence? Jake laughed loudly. No, ma'am, none whatsoever. His lie was so smooth it almost passed as truth. Almost. I rose. The scrape of my chair cut through the room with a sharp metallic sound. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Jake's head snapped back so fast you would think someone had pulled his collar. I stepped forward. Calm. Controlled. Military posture. I faced the council members first. I would like to address domestic safety concerns involving Jake Harlow. The entire room shifted. Conversations died instantly. The buzzing lights suddenly felt louder. Someone behind me whispered, "Oh, no," under their breath. Jake froze for 1 second before he sprang to his feet. His chair toppled backward with a loud clang. "Sit down, Nora," he barked. "Sit down right now." His voice was too loud for the room, too sharp, too revealing. I kept my voice level. I will not sit down. A few council members leaned forward with interest. Deputy Luke Morrison stood in the back near the exit, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I continued, "There have been incidents of intimidation, aggressive behavior, and one physical assault against a household member." The air tightened like a drum being stretched. People stared. Not at me, at Jake. No one moved. No one breathed. Jake's face reddened instantly. "You are a liar," he shouted, "a crazy liar. You think people here care about your sob stories because you wear that uniform." His voice cracked on the last word. Cracks. I kept my eyes locked on his. "This is not about my uniform. This is about your behavior." He lunged. For one split second, the world snapped into slow motion. He did not reach for a chair. He did not reach for an object. He reached for me. A forward surge of rage and panic. His hand shot out. His body leaned in. He intended to shove me in front of dozens of witnesses. He forgot one thing. Other people existed in the room. Before he made contact, strong hands grabbed him from behind. Deputy Luke wrapped an arm around Jake's chest and pulled him back with practiced restraint. Jake thrashed, cursing, spitting out half-formed threats. "Let me go," he yelled. "She is ruining my life." Luke stayed calm. "That is enough, Jake. Do not make me escort you out of here." Jake struggled harder. The town watched in stunned silence. Someone in the second row gasped. Someone else whispered, "I knew something was off with him." Another voice murmured, "He shoved his wife at Hannaford last year." I saw it. The council president cleared her throat, face pale. "Miss Whitfield," she said softly, "are you making a formal complaint?" "Yes," I said. My voice did not waver. "I already have, and I will continue." Jake let out a furious yell. "This is lies. She is making things up. She always hated me." Luke tightened his hold. "Jake, stop! You are done." Jake's breath came in ragged bursts. Red-faced, sweating, exposed, in front of the entire town. That was the moment the shift happened. The moment his power cracked wide open under the weight of witnesses. The moment the narrative slipped from his hands into mine. The town hall erupted in quiet murmurs. People who never paid attention to our family suddenly cared. They stared at him not with sympathy but with recognition. Troublemaker, bully, abuser. A man who had finally shown his true self in the one place he never expected to be seen. That was public exposure moment number one. The moment he realized he no longer controlled who heard the truth. When Luke forced him toward the exit, Jake twisted just enough to meet my eyes. "You will regret this, Nora." I answered with calm he could not comprehend. "No, Jake, I will not." Outside the town hall, whispers followed him into the cold night air. Inside, every pair of eyes stayed on me. And for the first time in years, the town finally knew what kind of man Jake Harlow really was. The night of the town hall meeting, the air outside felt sharp enough to cut skin. People were still whispering as they left the building, their boots crunching across the frost-covered pavement. Some glanced at me with quiet sympathy. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Small towns pretend not to gossip, but everyone carries the pieces of a story home with them. I knew by morning the entire harbor would know what happened. Jake's rage, Luke holding him back, my accusation hanging in the air like smoke. But none of that prepared me for what I found when I walked into the house. My mother sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped so tightly she might have been trying to stop herself from shaking apart. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Her face was pale, as if the life had drained from her the moment Jake lost control in public. She looked up when I stepped in, and in her eyes I saw something I had not seen clearly in years. Panic. "Nora," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" I set my keys on the counter and walked toward her slowly. I told the truth. She flinched as if the word itself hurt her. "You humiliated him. Everyone was there. Everyone saw." Her hands flew to her face. "This will make it worse. He will be furious. He will." She could not finish the sentence. Her voice broke before the end. I knelt beside her chair. "Mom, stop. Listen to me." He humiliated himself. Not you. Not me. She pressed her palms to her temples, rocking slightly. You do not understand what happens when he is angry. You do not know. My chest tightened. I understood more than she thought. After everything I had seen, everything I had heard her fear made complete sense. Jake's rage was not new. It had been building for years behind closed doors, while the town pretended mild concern was enough. While I was overseas, while she tried to survive quietly. I placed my hand gently over hers. Mom, what else has he done? Her eyes darted toward the doorway like she expected him to come bursting through it at any second. Her breath hitched. Nora, please leave it alone. Please. She looked so small, so drained, as if trying to protect him had hollowed her out from the inside. I spoke softly. Mom, if you do not tell me the truth, I cannot help you. Something inside her cracked. Her shoulders slumped. Her breath shuddered out in one long sigh. She stared at the table as though reading something etched into the wood. He has all the accounts, she whispered. All of them. My checking, my savings, everything. He said managing money stressed me out. He said I should not worry about the details. He said he would take care of it. My heartbeat thudded painfully in my ears. How long? Years. She swallowed hard. He changed the password without telling me. I have to ask him for grocery money, rent money, anything. The room felt colder. It was worse than I expected, worse than anything I wanted to believe. But she was not finished. Her voice grew smaller. I do not have a retirement fund anymore. I blinked. What? He said we needed to consolidate, that it was smarter. I signed papers because I thought he understood finances better than I did, but it is gone. Drained. Nora, I do not have anything left. The world tilted. You had a pension. You worked 23 years at the inn. Where is it? She looked sick. I do not know. He keeps all the documents. My throat tightened. This was not just control. This was financial erasure, a tactic used by abusers to trap their partners in place. But then, she said the sentence that froze me completely. He made me sign the house. My father's house. Her voice cracked open. He said we needed a loan. For repairs. For emergencies. He said it was routine. He said he would handle everything. I asked quietly, Did you read the papers? She shook her head. Tears slid down her cheeks. I was scared to tell him no. He gets angry when I ask questions. My mother had always been gentle, but she was never weak. Seeing her like this felt like watching someone try to stand after being pushed to the floor too many times. I reached for her hands. They were cold. She whispered, He will lose it when he finds out what happened tonight. He will destroy everything. I could feel her pulse racing through her wrist. All those years she spent alone in this house, walking on eggshells, hiding bruises in silence, shrinking inside the very home my father built with love. Something inside me steadied with a clarity I had not felt since the desert. I lifted her chin gently. Mom, look at me. She did. For the first time in years, she met my eyes without looking away. I spoke quietly but firmly. I am here now. You are not alone. She crumbled. The tears came fast, her shoulders shaking like someone had finally loosened the weight she had carried for too long. I wrapped my arms around her and she folded into me, releasing years of fear in one long, trembling exhale. That was the first time she had let me hold her since my father died. The years between us seemed to collapse all at once, replaced by something raw and painfully human. When she finally pulled back, her voice was barely above a whisper. What is going to happen now? I wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. Now, I said. Now we take everything back. The house, the accounts, the truth, everything he stole. She stared at me as though trying to believe it. Then, in the faintest voice, she asked, Can we? I nodded. Yes, Mom, we can. The first collapse had happened. Hers. The next one would be his. I woke before sunrise the next morning, the house still wrapped in the heavy silence that comes after a night of unraveling truths. My mother was asleep on the couch, finally exhausted enough to rest after breaking open years of secrets. I covered her with a blanket and stepped quietly into the kitchen. My phone buzzed on the counter. An encrypted message alert. JAG, Captain Anthony Rivers, efficient as always. He was the kind of officer who moved through the world with precision. No wasted sentences. No unnecessary emotion. Only facts and the weight those facts carried. I opened the message. Nora. I reviewed the documents. We need to talk. Urgent. My stomach tightened. If a JAG officer used the word urgent, something was very wrong. I clicked the attached PDF. Page 1 held a digital scan of the mortgage renewal form. My mother's signature curved across the bottom, except it was not her signature. The loops were too wide, the angle too steep, and the pressure too heavy, like someone trying to mimic handwriting but choosing speed over accuracy. Rivers had highlighted the discrepancies and left a typed note beneath it. Signature mismatch, likely forged. Page 2. Another mortgage addendum. Again, my mother's signature appeared, but this time Jake's writing overlapped slightly with the witness section. Sloppy. Reckless. I felt heat rising in my chest. Rivers left another note. Same pattern of forgery, but it was page 3 that made my breath stop. A loan authorization document with my name on it. My name. Nora Whitfield. Signed in thick ink. Except I had never seen this form before. Never signed anything remotely like it. The signature matched neither my military paperwork nor my civilian documents. Someone had forged my name. Jake had forged my name. I felt something inside me shift from anger to calculation. Forgery, fraud, identity misuse, federal implications. This was not just family conflict. This was financial crime threaded through the foundation of my father's house. I scrolled down to Rivers' summary. Nora, the property was used as collateral for an $85,000 loan 3 years ago. Your mother's pension withdrawal coincides with the loan deposit. Funds appear to have been drained over a 12-month period. Strong indicators of coercive control. Contact local law enforcement immediately. Full JAG support available if needed. $85,000. My father's house. My mother's retirement. My forged signature. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. Jake had not just manipulated my mother. He had not just controlled her behavior, her money, her decisions. He had carved into the legacy my father built and used it as currency for his own selfish survival, and he thought no one would ever uncover it. He counted on chaos. He counted on my absence. He counted on my mother's silence. What he did not count on was me stepping back into this house with Army intelligence training JAG support documentation practices drilled into my bones and the kind of discipline that turns emotion into strategy. My mother stirred from the couch. I walked over and crouched beside her. Mom, we need to talk. She blinked up at me confused and scared all over again. What is it, Nora? I opened the message thread and turned the screen toward her. She studied the documents slowly. Her eyes moved from one signature to the next. When she reached the last page, her hand flew to her mouth. Oh, my God, her voice broke. I never signed that. I know. And that is my name, she whispered, pointing to the forged signature. Nora, I swear I never touched that paper. I covered her hand with mine. You do not have to swear anything, Mom. I believe you. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were different. Not fear, not helplessness. Something sharper, something closer to shame and awakening. I felt her breath shudder through her chest. He took everything from me, she whispered. No, Mom. He took what he could reach. We are taking the rest back. She looked at me like she was trying to understand what that meant. I stood and gathered the printed papers I had already prepared the night before. The bruise photos, the joint account statements, the tax letters addressed to Jake, the notebook entries, and now the forged documents. One stack, one case, one truth. I laid everything on the dining table. This is enough for a financial investigation. This is enough for a restraining order. This is enough to freeze accounts. This is enough to start a full legal strike. My mother pressed her trembling fingers to her lips. Will they believe us? The question was small but full of years of silence. I took her hand again. They will believe the evidence. She swallowed hard. What happens now? Now, I said. Now we build a case the way we build everything else. One piece at a time. She looked at the documents spread across the table. Proof of the world she had been living in. Proof of the lies she had been fed. Proof of a man who had wrapped himself around her life like a fist. She whispered, I did not realize how deep it went. That is how control works, Mom. It blinds you slowly, but once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. I picked up the folder and held it close. Jake had left fingerprints all over everything he tried to hide, and I had just found the trail. The battle for my father's house had officially begun, and Jake Harlow had no idea that the first strike had already landed. I spent years in Army intelligence learning how to break down threats, map their patterns, anticipate their moves, and dismantle them with precision instead of chaos. And as I stood in my father's living room with a folder full of evidence and a mother full of fear, I realized the only way to defeat a man like Jake was to stop treating him like a family problem and start treating him like an operational target. Not in violence, not in retaliation, but in structured discipline and strategy. So I laid it out the way my instructors at Fort Huachuca would have demanded clear phases mission-oriented, each step building on the one before it until there was nowhere left for him to run. Phase 1 was surveillance quiet and careful. The part Jake would never see coming because he believed surveillance belonged only to soldiers overseas, not daughters standing 3 feet from him. So I observed him the way I used to observe suspects on field operations, monitoring patterns as he paced, as he mumbled to himself, as he tried to reassert control over a house that was slipping through his fingers. I tracked when he left the house, when he drank, when he searched for documents he thought were hidden, and I recorded everything with my Army-issued smartwatch, capturing his tone, his threats, his bursts of aggression, each clip small but powerful, each one a nail in the structure he had built from intimidation. And as the footage grew, so did the clarity of his behavior, revealing a man who relied heavily on fear but fell apart every time he sensed a loss of control. Phase 2 was psychological pressure, not manipulation, but truth applied in strategic intervals, small reminders that he no longer operated in secrecy, that his actions were witnessed, documented, ready for scrutiny. And it began when I calmly set my phone on the table during his rants, letting him wonder whether it was recording, letting silence expose him more effectively than shouting ever could. Every time I looked at him with steady eyes instead of fear, I watched him recoil. Watched the panic flicker beneath the anger. Watched him realize that every outburst risked becoming evidence, his entire dominance built on the belief that nobody would challenge him now eroded under the weight of uncertainty. I created a type of psychological pressure that forced him out of his usual narrative and pushed him closer and closer to public mistakes he could not undo. Phase 3 was public exposure, something he had already handed me on a silver platter at the town hall meeting, but exposure had to continue, escalate, and spread through the community so that the story could no longer be controlled by him or minimized by anyone who used to shrug off his behavior as domestic business. And that meant ensuring witnesses knew the truth, ensuring murmurs turned into voices, ensuring his reputation cracked in the exact places where he once built his false confidence. Because nothing terrifies an abuser more than losing the community he uses as a shield. And by the time people whispered his name in the grocery store aisles, I knew public pressure was already reshaping the battleground. Phase 4 was the legal strike, the one phase that had to be executed perfectly. Not emotionally, not in haste, but through documentation, law enforcement coordination, and JAG guidance. And I prepared for it the same way I prepared for briefings overseas, methodically, with no room for error. I compiled every scanned document, every forged signature, every financial inconsistency, every bruise photo, every recorded threat, every discrepancy in the mortgage paperwork, then assembled them into a packet so clean that any investigator could trace Jake's wrongdoing without hesitation. And when I met with Deputy Luke and handed him the folder, his expression shifted from concern to determination, a quiet recognition that this was not only abuse but fraud, forgery, coercive control, and identity misuse, a full legal case ready to ignite. Phase 5 was asset freeze. The step that would choke off Jake's power at its root, because control through money was his strongest weapon. And once the sheriff's office reviewed the documents with JAG input, they moved quickly, filing for an emergency freeze on the accounts tied to the forged mortgage, halting the $85,000 loan flow and flagging the property as under investigation. And the moment those orders were filed, something changed in the energy of the house, like a shift in pressure before a storm. Because abusers thrive on resources, and when those resources vanish, they unravel their entitlement, cracking under the reality that the system they never thought could touch them is suddenly holding the reins. Phase 6 was social isolation, not for me, not for my mother, but for him, an inversion of the isolation he imposed for years. This phase was already unfolding on its own as the town hall incident spread across Bar Harbor. Neighbors whispering, coworkers avoiding him. Former friends keeping their distance, eyes turning cold when he walked through town, the community tightening around the truth instead of around his excuses and isolation, when directed at a man who once controlled every room he walked into, becomes a mirror. He cannot escape forcing him to see himself the way others do, stripping away the illusion that he was untouchable. By the time all 6 phases were outlined in my notebook, the strategy no longer felt like revenge. It felt like architecture, measured, solid, purposeful. My father always said a house stands only when its framework is sound, and as I studied each phase, I realized I was rebuilding something more important than evidence. I was rebuilding safety, I was rebuilding my mother's freedom. I was rebuilding the truth Jake tried to bury. And when the time came to strike, I would have every structure in place. Every proof accounted for, every witness ready, every legal thread pulled tight. He had spent years tightening his grip. I would spend days loosening every finger. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a postal worker who looked grateful to be anywhere except our front porch. My mother collected the mail every day like a ritual, but when she saw the official seal stamped on the corner, she froze, her fingers tightening around the stack until the edges bent. She whispered my name as if calling for help in a language she had forgotten how to speak. Jake was in the living room watching television with the volume turned up too loud, the kind of loud that announces dominance rather than entertainment. My mother stepped toward him slowly as if approaching a sleeping animal she prayed would not wake. "Jake, there is something for you." He muted the TV and snatched the envelope from her hands. One glance at the return address, the sheriff's office, and something inside him snapped like a dry branch. His jaw clenched, his breath hitched, and then the storm hit. He tore the envelope open without reading the instructions carefully. The moment he saw the words, summons and investigation, the color drained from his face before returning in a violent rush. His voice erupted through the house, a sound so raw it felt like the walls themselves recoiled. "What the hell is this?" He crumpled the letter and threw it across the room. My mother flinched so hard she stumbled back into the counter. I stepped forward, calm, steady recording device already active on my smartwatch, capturing every syllable. He spun toward me. "This is you. This is your doing." His finger jabbed toward the summons as if the paper itself were alive. "You think you can walk in here with your little soldier suit and tell lies about me?" I kept my gaze level. "There are no lies in that letter, Jake. Only facts." He lunged toward the coffee table and swept everything off it in one violent motion. A lamp crashed to the floor, magazines scattered, remote batteries rolled under the couch. My mother covered her ears. Jake turned back toward me, chest-heaving sweat beading at the corner of his forehead. "You think the military will save you. You think that uniform makes you untouchable." His voice cracked into a scream. "You are nothing. Nothing!" I stood still, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Men like Jake reveal more in their rage than they ever will in their calm. Every word was evidence. Every threat was documentation. Every accusation was another nail in the structure he had built from intimidation. I tapped my wrist subtly, ensuring the recording caught every decibel. He prowled around the room like a caged animal, kicking a chair so hard it slammed into the wall and left a dent. My mother sobbed in the corner, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the counter as if anchoring herself to something solid. Jake looked at her with disgust. Look at you, crying, pathetic. Without me, you would be living in a shack, she whispered through her tears. Jake, please, please, stop. Her plea only fed his fury. He pointed at her like she was a problem he intended to erase. You ruined this. Both of you. She recoiled. I stepped between them, not close enough to escalate, but close enough to draw his attention away from her. Jake, I said calmly, forcing each word to remain steady. You brought this on yourself. His face twisted. Do not talk to me like that. You think you can run to the sheriff. You think you can turn the town against me. He paced again, movements jerky and uncontrolled. They will not believe you. Nobody will believe you. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He already knew the town did believe me. They saw him at the town hall. They whispered about him in the aisles of Hannaford. His power was slipping, and he felt it. Rage poured out of him in waves. He shoved the couch. He knocked a picture frame off the wall. He slammed his fist into a cabinet door. But he never touched me. Not once. Because even in his fury, he remembered the consequences. He remembered the neighbors who had seen the bruise. He remembered the town hall witnesses. He remembered the recording on my wrist that terrified him more than any physical threat. That was the thing about men who rely on fear. They crumble the moment the world witnesses their cracks. My mother slid down the wall, trembling tears streaking her cheeks as she whispered, Nora, please, make him stop. I shook my head gently. I cannot stop him. He stopped himself the moment he opened that letter. Jake roared again, a wordless sound of frustration that died quickly in his throat. He was unraveling faster than even I expected. Years of control evaporating in minutes. His chest rose and fell in ragged heaves as he glared at me with pure hatred mixed with something else. Panic. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the table as if needing something to hold on to. You think you won? He spat. You think this will end well for you. You have no idea who you are messing with. I stepped forward just enough for him to see the steadiness in my eyes, the steadiness he had never managed to break. No, Jake. You have no idea who you are messing with. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. No threats, no curses. Only breath. Heavy, uncertain, unraveling. My smartwatch blinked softly. Every word recorded. Every threat captured. Every crack exposed. Jake had begun to break, and I had everything I needed to bring the entire structure down. Hannaford had always been the one place in Bar Harbor where I felt anonymous growing up. Tourists wandered the aisles for snacks before hiking Acadia. Locals compared prices on produce. Teenagers lingered near the bakery. It was ordinary, predictable, safe. At least, it used to be. I walked in on a chilly Saturday morning, hoping to grab coffee and a few groceries before meeting Deputy Luke. The store was busy. Carts clattered, conversations floated between aisles. Someone's child laughed near the cereal section. Normal life. Something I had been craving ever since stepping back into this town. I moved toward the dairy aisle when I heard it, a familiar rhythm of footsteps, heavy, unsteady, fueled by bitterness rather than purpose. Jake. I felt the air change before I saw him. A sudden shift in the noise, the way people's attention subconsciously moved toward tension before they could even identify it. I turned. There he was, eyes bloodshot, shoulders rigid, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. The summons had shaken him harder than I expected. He looked like a man walking on legs that no longer trusted him. His cart was empty. He hadn't come to shop. He had come to confront. Nora. His voice tore through the aisle like a rusted blade. Several heads turned immediately. I didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't respond. That made him snap. He stormed toward me, pushing the empty cart aside so violently it rattled against a display of granola bars and sent them crashing to the floor. People stopped. Conversations froze mid-sentence. A whole aisle turned into witnesses. Good. Let him speak. He jabbed a shaking finger toward me. You're ruining my life. His voice thundered, echoing across dairy coolers and metal shelves. A woman near the yogurt section gasped. A father pulled his son closer. A teenage employee froze mid-step, eyes wide. Jake kept going. "She's lying about me. She's poisoning this whole town against me because she thinks wearing a uniform makes her better than everyone." The words spilled out fast, unfiltered, raw with panic. He wasn't calculating anymore. He wasn't controlling his image. He was unraveling in real time. I stood still, hands relaxed, shoulders steady, watching him without expression. The calmer I was, the more frantic he became. "You think you can take everything from me? The house, the money, my reputation?" He slapped his chest with an open hand. "I built that home. I held this family together." My voice was quiet, firm. "You forged documents, Jake. You threatened us. You hit me." His face contorted shame and fury, twisting together into a mask of desperation. "You deserved it." The aisle went silent, completely silent. A collective intake of breath rippled through the store. A woman in her late 60s, standing beside a shopping cart full of cleaning supplies, raised her phone slowly, subtly at first, then openly once she realized others were watching too. Her name was Mary Townsend. She was the admin of the town's biggest Facebook group, Bar Harbor Watchdogs, and she recorded every second. Jake didn't notice her. He was too consumed by his own meltdown. He stepped closer until he was inches from my face, spit flying as he shouted, "You walked out on your own mother. You come back and suddenly you think you can control everything. You're nothing but a pathetic soldier girl with a messed up head." A murmur rolled through the aisle. Someone whispered, "Oh, hell no!" Another voice said, "She served overseas. Who does he think he is?" Jake's rage hit a fever pitch. "Look at you," he yelled, "pretending you're some kind of hero. You're ruining my life. You hear me? Ruining it." He raised his hand not to hit me, not this time, but to emphasize the threat, to reclaim the fear he always counted on. But he didn't realize something crucial. When a man exposes himself in public, when a community watches him explode without provocation, the narrative stops belonging to him. For the first time, it belonged to me. I lifted my wrist slightly. The smartwatch gleamed under the store lights. His eyes darted to it. Fear flickered. "You recording this?" His voice cracked. "Maybe I said, maybe not, but everyone else is." He spun around. Phones were raised from 3 different angles. People stared with narrowed eyes, not at me, not with judgment, but with solidarity. The old woman lowered her phone just enough to say, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Jake's oxygen seemed to vanish. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a choking breath filled with humiliation. He backed away, slowly stumbling into a display of canned soup and knocking half of it over. A clang echoed through the aisle. He kept moving backward, desperate to escape the spotlight he'd stepped into himself. By the time he reached the exit, he was shaking so hard he could barely grip the cart. A manager followed him to the door. A teenage employee whispered, "Should we call the sheriff?" Someone answered, "They'll see the video. They'll come." I exhaled slowly and picked up a carton of milk, pretending my heart wasn't pounding in my ears. Pretending his words hadn't pierced old trauma I hadn't fully unpacked. But the truth was simple. He had lost control. He had exposed himself twice now, and this time the whole town saw him break. My phone pinged before I reached the checkout. A message from Mary Townsend. "Video posted. It's already getting shares. We've got your back, sweetheart." I stared at the notification, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not vindication, support, community, witnesses, the kind of power Jake could never take back. This was public exposure moment number 2, and it was the moment the town chose sides. Mine. The video from Hannaford spread across Bar Harbor faster than low-tide gossip on a summer morning. By noon, it had over 400 comments in the Bar Harbor Watchdogs group, and by evening, Luke had already texted me twice asking if I could come into the station the next morning. Not as a suspect, not as a witness in waiting, as the complainant in a case that had finally reached legal ignition. When I walked into the sheriff's office the next day, the air felt different, charged, focused the way a command tent feels right before a coordinated operation begins. Sheriff Donlin was standing near the whiteboard, arms crossed, reading through printed screenshots of the Hannaford video. Luke sat nearby with a legal pad full of notes. Captain Rivers appeared on screen via secure video call uniform, crisp demeanor, sharp as ever. It looked less like a small-town law enforcement office and more like a task force briefing room. Luke stood when I entered. "Nora." "Good. We are ready." Sheriff Donlin motioned me forward. "Let us get started." His voice held a tone I had only heard during crisis responses measured deliberate. The sheriff tapped the Hannaford printout. "This video alone is enough to demonstrate aggressive behavior, public disturbance, and intent to intimidate. But combined with everything else you and your captain provided..." He shook his head. "This is a full case, not a complaint." Captain Rivers spoke next, his voice steady through the speakers. "I reviewed the forged documents again last night. The signatures on the mortgage addendums and loan authorization are unquestionably falsified. Your mother could not have signed them, and the one with your name on it is not even a close match. That alone constitutes federal forgery." Luke set a folder on the table. Inside were the printed images of my bruise, the financial spreadsheets showing the disappearing funds, and the transcripts of the audio clips I recorded. Jake's voice filled the room even though the recording was silent on the page. "You are nothing. You think the military will save you? You're ruining my life." I swallowed, forcing myself not to look away. Sheriff Donlin opened a new file. "We're submitting 4 charges." His tone left no room for doubt. 1 domestic violence based on the assault at the house and your bruise photos. 2 financial fraud tied to the forged mortgage and the $85,000 loan. 3 forgery, 2 signatures from your mother, 1 from you. 4 coercive control based on recorded statements, your mother's testimony, and long-term behavioral patterns. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the controlled adrenaline I felt before a field operation. The sheriff continued. "Once this packet goes in, the judge will likely grant a temporary restraining order immediately. We are requesting a 50-foot distance restriction," Luke added. "And if he violates it even once, we will arrest him on the spot." Captain Rivers interjected like a commander, issuing final instructions. "Nora, this is where your discipline matters most. No contact with him, no baiting, no confrontation. Let the legal system track his moves. Let him incriminate himself on his own." I nodded. "Understood." The sheriff leaned forward. "We also need your mother's statement." My stomach tightened. She was fragile, shaken, still processing the truth she had avoided for years. But she was also brave enough now to face it. She arrived an hour later, walking into the station with hesitation, but not the same paralyzing fear I'd seen weeks earlier. She sat beside me, hands trembling, but when Sheriff Donlin asked Evelyn, "Can you tell us how Jake controlled your finances?" something steeled inside her. She told them everything, how he made her close her personal account, how he insisted on handling all the bills, how he pressured her to sign documents she never fully understood, how he monitored her calls, how he made her feel trapped and helpless. Her voice cracked, but she kept going, and with each word she reclaimed a piece of herself Jake had taken. Luke wrote everything down. The sheriff listened intently. Captain Rivers added notes. When she finished, silence settled over the room, not uncomfortable but heavy with truth, finally spoken aloud. The sheriff stood. "I am filing these charges within the hour. Luke, escort Nora and her mother home afterward." Luke nodded. "Absolutely." As we stood, Captain Rivers addressed me directly. "If he approaches you again, notify law enforcement immediately. Do not engage. Remember exposure and documentation. Win battles, not confrontation." I knew he was right. The legal strike was underway. We left the station together, my mother clutching my arm. The wind outside was sharp, biting a reminder that winter in Maine rarely shows mercy. But for the first time since coming home, the cold didn't feel hostile. It felt cleansing. When we reached the house, a marked patrol car pulled into the driveway behind us. A deputy stepped out and handed me a folded paper. Judge approved it. "Temporary restraining order, effective immediately." My mother inhaled sharply as she read the bold print. "Jake Harlow is prohibited from coming within 50 feet of Nora Whitfield or Evelyn Whitfield. He is prohibited from entering the residence. He is prohibited from contacting either party directly or indirectly. 50 feet. A line he could not legally cross, a boundary he could not break without consequences, a wall reinforced not by fear but by law. My mother whispered, "We are protected." For now, I said, "The real battle is coming. But tonight we rest." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. Maybe for the first time in a decade, she believed that safety was possible, that the nightmare wasn't permanent, that someone was finally standing between her and danger. Luke stepped beside me. "The sheriff will serve the order to Jake before sunset. He'll know exactly what he's facing." I nodded, exhaling a long, steadying breath. The legal strike had landed, clean, precise, irreversible, and Jake had no idea yet that the system he once thought would ignore his behavior was now closing in around him like a tightening vice. The next phase would break him, completely. The restraining order had been active for less than 24 hours when the storm finally hit. I woke to the muffled crunch of gravel outside the house, a sound too heavy and too reckless to be a neighbor or delivery truck. My instincts, sharpened by years of deployments, kicked in before my eyes were even fully open. I moved to the window, quietly pulling the curtain back just enough to see. Jake's truck sat crooked in the driveway engine, still running headlights glaring through the early morning mist like a pair of enraged eyes. He slammed the driver's door so hard the entire frame shuddered. My mother's sharp breath caught behind me. "Nora!" I held up a hand, signaling her to stay back. The restraining order was clear. He was not allowed within 50 feet of us or the property, and now he was 10 feet from the front door. This was no misunderstanding. This was escalation. I tapped my smartwatch. The recording activated with a soft vibration. Everything from this moment forward would be captured. Jake charged up the porch steps, his boots slamming each plank like hammer blows. The house trembled at the impact. He grabbed the doorknob and twisted violently. Locked. He rattled it, then kicked it, then leaned in close enough that I could hear his breath through the wood. "Open this door. Open it right now. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me?" My mother whimpered behind me. I steadied her with one hand and reached for my phone with the other. I dialed Luke. He picked up on the first ring. "He's here," I whispered, violating the order, trying to break in. There was no hesitation on the other end. "We are on our way. Do not engage. Keep the door locked." Behind me, Jake's voice rose to a full-throated snarl. "You want to ruin my life? Fine, fine. Let's finish this." He pounded his fist against the door again and again, the blows shaking dust from the ceiling. The camera above the porch one I installed quietly the night after the grocery store collapse recorded every second. His face distorted with rage, his words slurring with desperation, his body lunging against a door he had no legal right to approach. He kicked again, harder this time, leaving the faintest crack in the lower panel. My mother sobbed, "Please, Nora, please." I placed myself between her and the entrance, my voice low and steady. "He cannot get in, and even if he could, he cannot win." Outside, tires screeched. Another vehicle arrived, fast, heavy official. A second later, blue and red lights washed across the walls of the living room, their rotating glow turning the space into something that felt both surreal and inevitable. Jake froze mid-kick. The cruiser doors slammed. Footsteps approached. A firm voice called out, "Step away from the house, Jake, now!" Jake spun around, confusion and fury twisting across his face. "What? No. No. She called you?" "This is my home." Deputy Luke stepped into view, one hand on his duty belt posture, controlled and commanding. He was not the classmate I remembered from high school. He was law enforcement now, steady, trained, unshakable. "You are in violation of a court order," Luke said. "You need to step away immediately." Jake laughed, a wild, spiraling laugh that never touched his eyes. "Violation? What violation? This is my property. My family. You can't tell me." Sheriff Donlin stepped beside Luke. "Actually, we can." His voice cut through the yard like winter wind. "The restraining order, the fraud investigation, the forgery charges ring a bell." Jake's jaw dropped. He looked from one officer to the other, then back at the house as if expecting me to rush out and protect him the way my mother once did. I remained inside, silent, steady, watching through the narrow slit of the curtain. Luke opened a file. His tone was official. Controlled. Jake Harlow, you are under arrest for fraud, forgery, coercive control, and violation of a restraining order. Jake stumbled backward as though the words themselves hit him. Wait. No! You don't understand. She's lying. She's turning everyone against me. I didn't do anything wrong. This is all her. Luke raised a hand. Save it for the judge. Sheriff Donlin stepped forward. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Jake's panic surged. He shook his head violently and backed toward his truck. No, I'm not letting you take me. You hear me? I'm not. The sheriff tapped his radio. Officer Daniels blocked the vehicle. A second patrol car cut off the exit. Jake froze, trapped. He looked around wildly like he was searching for an escape route that no longer existed. When he finally stopped moving, Luke repeated the command. Turn around, hands behind your back. Slowly, reluctantly defeated Jake complied. His shoulders slumped. His hands shook. The cuffs clicked around his wrists with a metallic finality that echoed through the frosty morning air. For a brief second, he turned toward the house toward me. Eyes narrowed, voice low enough only I could hear. You'll regret this. I stepped into view behind the glass expression, cold, unbroken. No, I mouthed. I won't. The sheriff guided him toward the cruiser. Luke lingered just long enough to look up at me with a subtle nod that said everything without needing words. It is done. Jake ducked into the back seat of the patrol car. The door slammed shut. The engine rumbled. Then the cruiser pulled away its lights, cutting across the snowy driveway. For the first time in years, my mother exhaled without trembling. I watched the taillights disappear down the road until they became nothing but faint red dots swallowed by distance. I said nothing. I didn't have to. Justice had finally stepped onto our porch, and I didn't need a single word to meet it. 1 week after the arrest, the house felt quieter than it had in years. Not peaceful yet, not entirely safe, but quiet in a way that suggested something poisoned had finally been drained from the walls. My mother and I moved through the rooms, slowly relearning how to exist without flinching at every sound. The restraining order, the legal strike, the arrest, they had carved out a space where healing could breathe. But abusers rarely leave a clean exit behind. They reach back with the same hands that once caused damage, trying to rewrite themselves into victims or saints, hoping someone will accept their rewritten story. Jake was no different. The first sign came through the mail slot, a thick envelope with the return address of a law firm 2 towns over. My mother and I exchanged a wary look before I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a long, overly formal letter filled with phrases like mitigating circumstances, emotional strain, and misunderstanding between parties. I scanned further down and found the real purpose. Mr. Harlow requests leniency during the upcoming proceedings and seeks an opportunity to reconcile peacefully with the Whitfield family. My mother let out a shaky breath. He wants leniency. After everything. She sank into the chair opposite me, as if her bones could not hold her upright anymore. I slid the letter aside. This is not an apology, Mom. This is a strategy. A desperate one. She nodded slowly, rubbing her hands together in a nervous rhythm. A knock on the screen door made her jump. It was Luke stopping by as part of his follow-up rounds. When he saw the envelope on the table, he grimaced. Let me guess. Appeal for mercy. I handed it to him. He scanned the page, snorted once, and shook his head. They always do this right before charges solidify. He looked at my mother gently. Do not let this confuse you. He is not sorry. He is scared. My mother swallowed hard, nodding again. I could see how the old patterns twisted in her chest, the instinct to soothe, to forgive, to believe a man who had never earned belief. I reached across the table and touched her hand. You don't owe him forgiveness. She squeezed my fingers. I know. I'm just tired. And then, 2 days later, the second sign arrived. My mother's phone lit up with an unknown number. She answered without thinking. Old habits, old reflexes, and the moment she did, her face went pale. Nora, it's him! I took the phone from her hand and put it on speaker, setting it face down on the table. Jake's voice came through thin, desperate, stripped of the bravado he had carried for years. "Evelyn, please. I need to talk to you." My mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Jake continued his breath hitching. "They're saying things that aren't true. They're trying to paint me like some kind of monster. I need you to understand. I need you to help me." I stared at the phone, expression cold. There was no apology. Not even the illusion of one. Only self-pity. Only fear. Only the need to salvage himself. He kept talking, words tripping over themselves. "Evelyn, you know I never meant for things to go this far. You know I was under stress. You know how much I did for this family. If you could just tell them," my mother whispered, voice breaking. "Jake, stop." Her whisper carried more strength than any shout. He paused. "You owe me that much," he said finally. That was the moment the last thread snapped inside her. She straightened slightly, shoulders trembling but resolute. She whispered one word. "No." Silence on the line. My mother repeated it louder this time, her voice cracking open. "No, Jake, I don't owe you anything. Not anymore." Another long silence, a breath. Then his voice hardened, the apology mask falling away. "You're making a mistake. Once this goes through..." She cut him off. "Goodbye, Jake." She ended the call with a firm tap, then collapsed into tears. Not fear this time. Release. I picked up the phone, turned it off, and placed it face down. Relief washed through her like air returning to a collapsed lung. I knelt beside her and wrapped my arms around her until she could breathe again. Later that afternoon, while the house was finally settling into a calm lull, my phone buzzed with a message from the sheriff's office. Charges moving forward. DA declining any plea for reduced penalties. I exhaled a slow, grounding breath. The full weight of the law was coming for him. Fraud, forgery, coercive control, violation of a restraining order. Every piece of evidence was aligned. Every official statement matched. Every witness was ready. My mother came to stand beside me as I read the message. "Does this mean..." "It means he will face everything he did. No more hiding, no more excuses, no more shifting blame." She leaned her head on my shoulder. For the first time in years, she didn't look afraid of the future. Just uncertain. Just human. Just healing. That night, as the wind pressed softly against the windows and the house finally felt like a home again, she asked quietly, "Nora, will you ever forgive him?" I stared out into the dark Maine sky, listening to the distant waves crash against the rocky shoreline. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Accountability was. Consequences were. I answered softly but firmly. "No. Actions have consequences." She nodded. Then, "So do words." And she chose hers too. "No." Jake's audacity had tried to slither its way back into our lives. But for the first time, neither of us opened the door. The prosecution would handle the rest. The day of the hearing felt colder than the weather forecast promised. Maine winters always carried a bite, but that morning the air held something sharper, something final. My mother and I sat together in the second row of the courthouse, hands loosely intertwined, not because she needed reassurance anymore, but because we had finally learned how to stand side by side. Luke sat nearby, not as a friend from high school, but as the deputy who had walked us through every step of this battle. And on the screen at the front, appearing via secure video feed from Maryland, was Captain Rivers, calm, precise, unshakable, just as he had been since the moment I called him. Jake sat across the room, flanked by his attorney, his wrists free, but his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the charges had finally sunk into his bones. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence, in arrogance, in the bluster he used to fill every corner of a room. The judge entered, and the room shifted into a quiet that carried the gravity of everything we had endured. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was the culmination of years of fear, months of evidence, and one long overdue reckoning. The judge reviewed each charge meticulously, her tone steady and unhurried. Fraud, forgery, coercive control, violation of a restraining order. She recited the summary of evidence, the documents, the statements, the videos, the financial trails. At one point, she raised a page containing my forged signature. The courtroom lights reflected off the glossy surface. This signature does not match Ms. Whitfield's verified federal and military records. Jake shifted uncomfortably. The judge continued. Mr. Harlow, you used property belonging to the late Thomas Whitfield as collateral for an $85,000 loan without the legal consent of either owner. You forged signatures to secure that loan. You exercised financial and emotional control over Mrs. Whitfield. You violated a court order less than 24 hours after it was issued. Jake's attorney attempted one last weak argument, citing stress, misunderstanding, emotional turmoil. The judge raised her hand. Enough. This court has heard ample excuses. It is time for consequences. My mother exhaled a sound that was almost a sob, almost a prayer. The judge straightened her papers and delivered the ruling with the clarity of a hammer falling. The property located at 119 Shore Path, including the residence and detached workshop, is hereby restored to joint ownership under Nora Whitfield and Evelyn Whitfield, effective immediately. My heartbeat surged heavy and bright. My father's house, my father's workshop, returned. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, Mr. Harlow is prohibited from any form of contact, direct or indirect, with either party for a period of 10 years. The words felt like a door slamming shut in the best possible way. And finally, the defendant is required to repay the full amount of the fraudulently secured loan. No negotiation, no delay. Full restitution. Jake closed his eyes as if bracing for a blow he knew he deserved. The judge concluded. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck once sharp and final. It was over. Completely. When we walked out of the courthouse, the cold no longer felt punishing. It felt clean, like winter air sweeping away the last of something rotten. As we reached the parking lot, my mother stopped and turned to me with tears in her eyes, not the frightened kind I'd grown up watching, but the kind that comes when a heavy weight is finally set down. "Your father would be so proud of you," she whispered. I swallowed hard and hugged her gently. "We're just getting started, Mom." We drove home in near silence, the good kind, the kind that meant peace was settling in for the first time in years. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, not physically but spiritually, as if it had been holding its breath all this time and was finally allowed to exhale. Inside, the air felt lighter. My mother walked from room to room, touching surfaces with reverence rather than fear. I headed for the workshop, my father's sanctuary, the heart of everything he built. It had been neglected for years. Dust coated the benches, tools were scattered. Gray paint that Jake had slapped over the oak beams peeled at the corners like old scabs. But beneath the grime, the bones were still there. Strong, honest, worth saving. I opened the windows to let the sea air and the scent of salt and pine sweeping across the room like a blessing. I rolled up my sleeves. The first stroke of sandpaper across the wooden beam felt like reconnecting with my father's hands. This was the place he taught me how to measure twice cut once. The place he once told me the truth always shows in the grain if you're patient enough. So I worked, hour after hour, day after day, removing the gray paint Jake had used to bury the history of this room, restoring the deep warm color of the original oak, reorganizing the tools, fixing the bench, wiping dust from the compass my father left behind, the same one he placed in my palm when I was 12 and said, "Build things that last." My mother joined me sometimes, handing me brushes, sorting nails, quietly humming old songs she hadn't dared sing in a decade. We repaired the broken window Jake had cracked during one of his drunken tirades. We repainted the door he had slammed so often it no longer closed properly. We rebuilt the shelves, rehung the old sign. Whitfield Workshop, handcrafted boats since 1978. The workshop came back to life slowly, like something rekindling after nearly going out. And with every beam restored, every plank scrubbed clean, I felt something rebuilding in me too. The anger quieted, the tension eased, the ache softened into something closer to peace. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Bar Harbor and painted the workshop in gold, I stepped back to look at the space my father built. It wasn't finished yet, but it was ours again. Fully, legally, spiritually. Jake was gone. The law had spoken. The debts were his to repay. The house and the future were ours to rebuild. I rested my hand on the smooth oak beam. "Dad," I whispered, "we brought it home." The porch looked different in the evening light. Warmer, softer, almost forgiving. It was the same weathered wood, the same railing my father once leaned against while drinking his morning coffee, the same steps I had run down as a kid with untied sneakers and scraped knees. But now, standing there with the tide humming in the distance and the sky fading into a watercolor of pink and gray, something felt restored in a way I had never imagined possible. This was the exact spot where Jake had greeted me with the words, "Welcome back," and the backhand that followed. The bruise had long faded. The echo of his rage no longer lived in the planks beneath my feet. The memory remained, yes, but it no longer owned me. I stepped onto the porch, slowly letting the boards creak under my weight. The breeze rolling off Frenchman Bay was cool and clean, carrying the scent of saltwater and evergreen. It brushed against my face with a kind of tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence that had once marked this place. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe deeply. This house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a home, reclaiming its truth. I rested my hand on the railing, tracing the grain with my fingertips. My father had sanded these boards himself, insisting that every edge be smooth, every detail intentional. He used to say, "A home isn't just a place, Nora. It's a reflection of the hands that built it." Jake's hands had tried to twist that reflection into something warped and hollow, but they failed, because my father's hands and mine were stronger, strong enough to undo the damage, strong enough to rebuild, strong enough to stand here now without fear. As the wind swept over the porch, I felt a strange clarity settle into my chest, a realization so sharp and steady it anchored itself in me like truth carved in stone. Iraq did not break me. Home did not break me either. They forged me, all of it. The dust storms in Baghdad, the IED explosion that stole Sergeant Molina the months of sleepless nights inside intelligence tents. The bruise Jake left on my face, the years of watching my mother shrink under control. She never deserved. Every moment had sharpened something inside me. Not bitterness, not hardness. Purpose, discipline, a deeper understanding of what strength truly looks like. Not fists, not threats, not domination. Strength was choosing to return, choosing to fight smart, choosing to stand firm without becoming the monster you were facing. Strength was justice delivered quietly. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of the screen door. My mother stepped out, wrapping her sweater tighter around her shoulders as she joined me on the porch. Her movements were tentative, as if she was still getting used to the idea that she could stand here without fear. She looked out at the horizon where the last edge of sunlight dipped behind the water. For a long moment, we just stood together, letting the wind fill the silence. She was the one who broke it. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. 4 simple words. But they carried the weight of a decade of distance, a decade of loneliness, a decade of choices she wished she could undo. I turned toward her. Her eyes shimmered with tears, not from pain this time, but from something gentler. Relief, gratitude, maybe even hope. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. She leaned her head against me the way she used to when I was a child, afraid of thunderstorms. Except now it was her storms that had finally passed. "Mom," I said softly, "I didn't come back to save you. I came back to stand with you." She let out a quiet breath, half sob, half laugh. For years, she had been bowed by a weight she did not deserve to carry. Now her posture felt different, straighter, steadier, as if she was slowly remembering her old strength. The porch lights flicked on automatically as the sky deepened into twilight. Warm yellow light bathed the steps, the same steps where Jake once stood, towering, furious, trying to assert control. Now the house illuminated us instead. 2 women, 2 survivors. two people reclaiming everything that had been taken from them. The breeze brushed against us again, gently lifting the strands of my hair. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell rang. A familiar sound. Steady. Rhythmic. Like the heartbeat of this town. My mother squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you're home." For the first time since I stepped off that flight from Iraq, I felt the same way. Really felt it. I wasn't returning to old wounds anymore. I was standing in the beginning of something new. Quiet justice doesn't come with applause. It doesn't come with shouting or triumph or spectacle. It comes with moments like this. A porch reclaimed, a house restored, a mother healing, a legacy protected, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories happen with nothing more than steady breath and a peaceful sky. I looked out at the darkening shoreline and whispered to myself, to the wind, and maybe to my father too. "We're home now, and we're finally whole." The letter from the Army arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked neatly between a hardware store flyer and a utility bill. Fort Meade. A new assignment, a prestigious one, the kind of posting most intelligence officers my age would fight for. I held the envelope for a long moment before opening it, feeling the familiar blend of duty and restlessness stir under my ribs. My career had always been a clear, steady path. Deployment schedules, training rotations, mission briefings. But now, standing in the kitchen of a house I had nearly lost, watching my mother pour coffee with hands that were finally steady again, I felt something shift. I read the orders carefully. Report date 6 months from now. The Army was giving me time. Or maybe fate was. My mother sat down across from me, wrapping her fingers around her mug. She noticed the insignia on the envelope and tried to smile, though her eyes flickered with fear, the kind she tried to hide, the kind that came from years of waiting for bad news to return on a doorstep. She asked softly, "Are you leaving again?" I looked at her. The woman who had survived more than most people knew, who was just now learning how to breathe without waiting for footsteps or shouting or slammed doors. A woman rediscovering herself after a decade of shrinking to fit someone else's shadow. "Not yet," I said gently. "Not for a while." Her shoulders slumped in relief, and for the first time since I came home, she reached across the table without hesitation and took my hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a bridge finally rebuilt. Those first weeks after the verdict passed slowly but in a healing way, like the steady thaw of ice after a long Maine winter. My mother began therapy with a counselor in town. She started reconnecting with old friends. She even repainted the living room a soft coastal blue, saying, "I want this house to feel alive again." And it did. The rooms felt brighter, the air cleaner. Even the floorboards seemed to creak more kindly. But healing isn't a solitary act. It requires community. So I joined one. On Thursday nights, I found myself sitting in a church basement with a circle of veterans men and women who carried invisible scars, who knew the weight of silence too well. Some had served in Fallujah or Kandahar. One woman had flown medevacs in Syria. Another had been military police at Guantanamo. We shared stories not to relive them, but to unburden them. I spoke about Iraq, about Melina, about coming home to a bruise instead of a welcome, about the strange way trauma echoes across continents and through time. No one judged, no one pitied. They listened the way soldiers do, with quiet acknowledgement and deep respect. On Saturdays, I joined a support group for domestic abuse survivors, a room full of women from all walks of life. Teachers, nurses, retirees, single mothers, women whose partners had once convinced them they were small, unworthy, trapped. When I walked in the first time, a few whispered, "That's the soldier from the grocery store video." But the recognition wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the connection. I didn't go there to be a hero. I went there because I knew exactly how it felt to watch someone you once loved become the source of your fear. I knew what it meant to choose yourself after years of shrinking. I shared my story carefully, piece by piece, not for attention, but for truth. One woman older, her hands trembling slightly, squeezed my arm after a meeting and said, "You gave me courage. I filed my restraining order yesterday." Another whispered, "I finally told my daughter the truth." Healing wasn't linear, but it was happening in them, in my mother, in me. Meanwhile, the workshop became my sanctuary. Rebuilding it taught me something no deployment ever had, that restoration requires patience, not force. I spent mornings sanding beams and afternoons repairing drawers. The scent of sawdust and cedar clung to me long after I left the room, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. Sometimes my mother joined me humming softly to the old radio. Sometimes I worked alone listening to the quiet hum of the ocean through the open windows. The grief I carried for my father felt less like a wound now and more like a reminder, a compass pointing me back to the kind of life he believed in. Honest, steady, purposeful. One evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset glow over Frenchman Bay, my mother said, "You seem lighter." I thought about it. About Iraq. About the bruise Jake left on my face. About the courtroom. About the workshop. About this porch where everything had fallen apart and then slowly stitched itself back together. "Maybe I am," I answered. She rested her head on my shoulder. "You saved us." I shook my head gently. We saved each other. 6 months passed with the kind of quiet that feels earned, not accidental. When the date on my orders finally approached, I packed slowly, deliberately, folding each uniform piece with care. My mother hovered in the doorway. She wasn't shaking this time. She wasn't afraid. She smiled softly. "Fort Meade is lucky to have you." I hugged her, feeling the steadiness in her spine, the strength she had found again. "I'll be back, I promised. This is still home." As I loaded my last duffel bag into the Jeep, I paused at the edge of the porch, the same place where Jake had tried to break me. The wind rolled off the water, cool and gentle, carrying with it a sense of something sacred. I whispered almost to myself, "Becoming whole again doesn't mean forgetting. It means finally belonging to yourself." And as I drove away from the house my father built heading toward a future I chose, not one I escaped, I knew I had become whole, not despite everything that happened, but through it. When I finally left Bar Harbor for Fort Meade, the road ahead of me felt both familiar and foreign, a stretch of highway that had witnessed countless homecomings, yet never one exactly like this. The engine hummed beneath my hands, steady as a heartbeat, and the coastline rolled past on my left, the Atlantic shining with that cold, stubborn beauty that only Maine seems to understand. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, not because I was afraid Jake would suddenly appear there. He couldn't not anymore, but because part of me needed to see that small, gray-shingled house grow smaller and smaller until it became a memory instead of a battlefield. Leaving it wasn't abandonment. Leaving it was proof that the war inside those walls had finally ended, and for the first time in years, I wasn't running. I wasn't retreating. I wasn't escaping trauma disguised as home. I was carrying something different with me, peace, clarity, and the quiet conviction that comes only after you fought for your safety and earned it. The workshop lights were off when I drove away, but I knew the place was alive. My mother would keep it warm, keep it full of music and sawdust and that gentle hum of healing that had slowly replaced the tension. I imagined her at the table drinking morning coffee without flinching every time a car passed. Maybe she'd be out on the porch tending to the potted lavender she always wanted to plant, but never could because Jake hated the smell. Maybe she'd be laughing with Mrs. Calder from next door, the two of them catching up on lost years. Maybe she'd be sleeping deeply for the first time in a decade. I smiled at that thought. The kind of smile that doesn't fade immediately, the kind that lingers because it belongs to something real. Healing is slow, yes, but healing is possible. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. A message from Mary Townsend. "The women from the support group asked about you. They said your story helped them speak. Thought you'd like to know." I gripped the wheel tighter. Not out of fear, out of gratitude. If there is one thing the military teaches you, it's that survival isn't a solo act. You carry others. They carry you. And sometimes the quietest victories are the ones lived out in circles of folding chairs in church basements, where people whisper truths they were once too scared to say aloud. I drove through the morning fog, the world unfolding in soft layers of gray and silver. And as the miles stretched ahead, a new softness settled inside me, the understanding that becoming whole isn't about being unbroken. It's about owning every fracture, every scar, every hard-earned truth. It's about saying, "This happened. and I'm still here. Jake didn't get the last word. He didn't get the last punch. He didn't get the last memory. I did, not because I won something, but because I reclaimed something. And in that reclamation, I found a kind of strength I didn't know I was missing. The kind that grows quietly, the kind that holds steady even when the world tries to tilt beneath your feet, the kind that looks back at years of fear and says, "No more." As the main state sign disappeared behind me and the highway opened wide, I rolled down the window just an inch. The cold wind rushed in and hit my face like a baptism, a reminder that even after storms, especially after storms, the air can taste fresh again. That's when the truth hit me with a gentle finality. This isn't just my story. It never was. It belongs to anyone who has ever returned home after fighting battles overseas or inside their own living room only to discover a different kind of war waiting for them. It belongs to anyone who has ever been betrayed by someone they should have been able to trust. Anyone who has ever had their safety stolen. Anyone who has ever been told to shrink to stay quiet, to endure. Anyone who has ever needed to hear that leaving isn't weakness and coming back isn't failure. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood on the edge of their own porch and wondered whether they were strong enough to reclaim it. So as the sun finally broke through the clouds somewhere near Augusta, casting long gold stripes across the road, I reached for that small, quiet truth I'd carried for months. Healing doesn't erase the past. Healing puts the past in its place. And just as true justice is often quiet, it does not roar, it does not gloat, it does not demand applause, it simply stands, and so do you. And now, with everything behind me, finally settling like dust after a long march, I want to ask you something. Not as a soldier, not as a daughter, not as a survivor, but as someone who knows what it feels like to face a home that no longer feels safe. If you've ever walked through a doorway and felt fear instead of comfort, if you've ever returned to a place that should have protected you only to find pain waiting there, if you've ever stood in the middle of your own life and thought, "How did it come to this?" then I want you to know this. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Your safety matters. And you are not alone. So here's my invitation, simple, honest human. If you've ever returned home and found it wasn't safe anymore, share your story with me. I read every single comment, and you never know who might find strength in your words the same way others found strength in mine.